I was sitting at the edge of the kitchen table. The letter spread before me like a declaration I couldn't have anticipated. The words blurred for a moment as my hands shook. Not from age but from disbelief. They're trying to evict me. The thought reverberated in my mind. An echo of every moment I'd ever been underestimated, ignored, or dismissed. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, a home I had built, maintained, and protected through years of sacrifice. Yet here it was, slipping from my grasp not by force of law, but by the careless ignorance of those who should have known better. I paused, letting the quiet sink in, and couldn't help but wonder. Have you ever felt someone attempt to take from you what was always rightfully yours, believing you wouldn't notice until it was too late? It's a sharp, quiet kind of betrayal, one that strikes at the heart before the mind has a chance to react. A deep breath steadied me. This wasn't just a letter, it was a challenge, a reckoning. Somewhere in this envelope lay the opportunity to reclaim not just a property, but the dignity that had been questioned, dismissed, and underestimated. I reached for my papers, my mind racing with memories of every late night, every bill paid, every small triumph that had brought me here. The deed was there, hidden in plain sight, but the question was whether they'd ever see it, or if I'd have to show them in the moment that would decide everything. I folded the letter carefully, almost as if tucking it away could erase its existence. But the paper pressed against my fingers like a weight I couldn't shake. My mind kept circling the same impossible thought. They were trying to evict me from my own home. I had lived here for decades, paid every bill, fixed every leak, tended every corner. Yet it felt like all that effort was invisible, disregarded by the very people who should have understood its value. I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity or to burn the letter immediately. Both impulses wrestled inside me, leaving a hollow ache I hadn't felt in years. I walked to the living room, the floors creaking under each step, and sat by the window where the afternoon light slanted across the furniture. The house smelled of varnish and old wood, faint reminders of every repair I had ever undertaken. A memory flashed of the first day I stepped into this place. Paint peeling, carpets worn, yet full of potential. I had worked tirelessly to turn it into something I could be proud of. Every dent in the wall, every squeaky hinge told a story of care, a story that now seemed irrelevant to those who thought they could just barge in and claim it for themselves. My phone buzzed, dragging me back to the present. It was a message from my niece, innocently curious about some family matter, nothing to do with the eviction. I stared at the screen, then deleted the message, unwilling to respond. The house had become a stage for tension I hadn't anticipated, and every familiar face suddenly felt like an actor playing a part one didn't understand. How could people I had supported, who had known me for years, ignore the simple fact that I owned this place? The injustice simmered beneath the surface, a quiet flame that refused to die. I made myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling up and fogging the kitchen window, and tried to settle my racing thoughts. The eviction notice was official, yes, but I knew its authority was flawed. Somewhere in the drawer of my desk, the deed lay hidden, a small slip of paper that carried far more weight than anyone could imagine. I remembered the day I signed it, the precise moment when the property officially became mine. I had smiled at the thought of finally having security, a place where no one could challenge me. Yet here I was, trembling not because of legality but because of the audacity of those who ignored it. The past few years came rushing back, memories of long nights spent managing repairs, paying for the upkeep when others didn't even notice, quietly ensuring the home stayed standing. There had been arguments over money, quiet resentment from relatives, and times when I had second-guessed my own patience. Now it felt like all those efforts were being tested in the most direct way possible. I sat at the table and opened the top drawer of my desk, my fingers brushing over stacks of papers until I found it. The deed. A simple, yellowed sheet of paper, yet it carried a force that no verbal threat could match. I held it in my hands and felt a small surge of calm, knowing that the truth of ownership was still on my side. But calm was fleeting. The people behind the eviction were persistent, confident, and unaware of what they were challenging. I replayed conversations in my mind, moments when I had been dismissed, belittled, or simply ignored, all of which now seemed like subtle warnings of this confrontation. I thought about how carefully I had always lived, how much I had avoided unnecessary conflicts, believing in reason and fairness. Yet fairness had never been enough to protect me. Only knowledge, only preparation, could ensure I wouldn't lose what was rightfully mine. I left the kitchen and walked through the house, touching walls, opening windows, noticing details I had taken for granted. Each familiar sound and smell grounded me in a reality I refused to let go of. The house was more than wood and plaster. It was a record of years of effort, proof of a life lived responsibly. And the deed, resting in the drawer, was the ultimate confirmation of that fact. My mind began to focus, no longer overwhelmed by shock but turning toward strategy. How would I present it? When? And most importantly, how would I face those who had assumed they could take what wasn't theirs without consequence? Even as I planned, I felt a creeping sense of anger. Not blind rage, but the quiet fury of being underestimated, of having one's life and work dismissed. I thought about the small injustices I had endured quietly, the times I had let disrespect slide to avoid conflict. This, however, could not be ignored. The house, my home, demanded respect, and the deed was the final, unassailable proof that I was entitled to it. I rehearsed the words I might say, the calm but firm tone I would use when presenting it. Every scenario played out in my mind, from disbelief to confrontation to the eventual recognition of my rights. By evening, the shadows stretched long across the walls, and I sat once more at the table, the deed before me. I considered the irony of the situation. The very people who had underestimated me were about to witness the power of preparation and quiet patience. I thought of the lessons life had taught me, of the resilience born from years of navigating disrespect and neglect. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. This was about more than the house. It was about dignity, self-respect, and the unwavering certainty that truth and preparation always hold weight, even when others refuse to acknowledge them. I closed the drawer gently, feeling a strange combination of apprehension and resolve. Tomorrow, the confrontation would come, and the outcome would be determined not by who shouted the loudest, but by who understood the truth of ownership. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, a quiet comfort in a storm of tension. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was ready to face what was coming, armed not with anger alone but with clarity, patience, and the irrefutable proof of the deed that had never been read. The next morning, the house felt heavier, as if it was holding its breath along with me. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the staircase, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint tapping of a neighbor's broom outside. I wandered from room to room, observing the spaces I had spent years shaping, wondering how anyone could attempt to take it from me without even understanding what it represented. It wasn't just a collection of walls and floors. It was the sum of countless decisions, compromises, and labor that nobody seemed to remember. The betrayal stung not only because they had challenged my ownership, but because the people involved had believed they could override decades of effort with a signature or a casual assumption. I thought about who was behind the notice. Faces flashed in my mind. People I had trusted, neighbors, distant relatives, even the occasional family friend. Each one had known me in some capacity, yet none had paused to consider the truth of my claim. The audacity of it struck me, the sheer disregard for history and diligence. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, letting the morning light wash over the familiar contours of the living room. The room smelled faintly of dust and polish, reminders of all the small ways I had preserved this home. I traced the grain of the wooden table with my finger, letting memories of long nights fixing leaks, painting walls, and balancing budgets wash over me. It wasn't only the eviction notice that unsettled me. It was the realization that my careful attention to the house, the sacrifices I had made quietly, had been invisible. For years I had assumed that diligence and responsibility were enough, that people would naturally recognize the value of hard work. Now I knew that assumption had been naive. The world didn't always notice, and when it did, it could act recklessly. I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief, a potent combination that left my chest tight and my thoughts restless. I had to figure out how to respond. But first, I needed clarity. I needed to remember every step I had taken to protect what was mine, and in doing so, reaffirm my own confidence. I remembered one particular evening years ago when a pipe burst in the basement. I spent hours that night hauling buckets, drying the floors, and patching what I could. Nobody had noticed or acknowledged it at the time. The house had survived because of those quiet hours, and yet the people who now question my right to live here acted as if all of that effort meant nothing. That memory fueled a silent resolve inside me. I wouldn't let ignorance or arrogance erase decades of work. The deed, tucked safely in my desk, was proof not just of ownership, but of every decision and every act of care I had made along the way. The phone rang, pulling me from reflection. I hesitated before answering. On the other end was a voice, calm but confident, delivering yet another subtle reminder that the eviction was imminent. The words were polite, but beneath them lingered an assumption that I would comply without resistance. I found myself gripping the receiver, imagining a rebuttal, a way to assert my position without raising my voice unnecessarily. The situation required precision, clarity, and patience. It reminded me of countless times in life when patience had been my most reliable tool. Here, it would be tested in a new way, against people who believed authority alone could make the truth irrelevant. I spent the next hours revisiting the house, opening drawers, checking cupboards, and confirming that every important document was where it should be. The deed sat in its familiar spot, and my eyes lingered on it longer than necessary. In that paper lay my defense, my proof, my reassurance that the audacity of others could not erase reality. Yet even as I found comfort in its presence, I could feel the tension in my chest, a quiet pressure that refused to dissipate. I wasn't merely preparing to show the deed. I was preparing to confront a long-standing underestimation of my capabilities and my resolve. Memories of past conflicts surfaced as well. Arguments that seemed trivial at the time now appeared as early indicators of disregard. Relatives questioning minor decisions, neighbors dismissing advice, casual remarks undermining my judgment. The eviction attempt was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern. Recognizing this, I felt a strange clarity. This wasn't only about property. It was about reclaiming recognition, demanding respect, and standing firmly in a place I had earned through diligence and care. By afternoon, I had made a quiet plan. The confrontation would be deliberate, calm, and unwavering. I rehearsed in my mind how I would present the deed, anticipating disbelief, confusion, and perhaps even mockery. Each scenario was accounted for, every reaction mentally prepared for. And yet, beneath all that preparation, I allowed myself a small acknowledgement of fear. Confrontation, even when justified, carries a weight that must be borne with composure. The house, my sanctuary, would bear witness to my resolve, and I would not let anyone diminish its history or significance. As evening fell, I walked the perimeter of the yard, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The trees, the fence, the faint echo of footsteps from earlier neighbors, all reminded me that this was more than bricks and timber. It was a record of my life's efforts, a repository of memory and effort, and a symbol of quiet resilience. I realized then that the battle ahead was as much internal as external. I needed to maintain calm, focus, and clarity while asserting what was undeniably mine. I returned inside, letting the door close firmly behind me. The house felt protective, almost sentient in its quiet reassurance. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the table, flipping through old receipts, letters, and photographs that chronicled the years of care I had invested here. Each item was a reminder of diligence, responsibility, and foresight. They had attempted to make me feel powerless, but in that quiet room, surrounded by evidence of a life carefully lived, I began to feel a quiet strength growing. The eviction notice had ignited tension, but it had also sparked determination. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending the sum of all my choices and sacrifices. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. Ownership is more than a signature on paper. It is recognition of effort, endurance, and quiet perseverance. Tomorrow, when the confrontation came, I would not only present the deed, I would demonstrate that dignity and persistence cannot be erased by ignorance or audacity. The people attempting to evict me had underestimated the depth of my preparation, the clarity of my resolve, and the patience I had cultivated through a lifetime of challenges. I felt a mixture of anticipation and calm resolve. They had begun the fight, but I knew the outcome had already been quietly written in the small sheet of paper waiting in my desk. Evening settled over the house, and with it came a quiet emptiness that made the walls feel both protective and accusatory. I wandered through the rooms again, not to check the deed this time, but to confront the memories etched into each corner. The living room sofa had sagged slightly where I used to sit reading on long nights. The kitchen counters bore faint stains from meals prepared for family who sometimes took them for granted. Every detail reminded me of effort spent, of patience tested, and of moments where recognition had been scant. It struck me sharply how easily those same people could attempt to erase all of that with a single notice. I sat by the window and watched the street, expecting to see signs of life, faces that might challenge me, but there was nothing. Just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere down the block. Silence had a weight to it now, a tension that made me feel both alert and isolated. I thought about how often betrayal arrives quietly, not with a dramatic announcement, but in small, dismissive acts that accumulate over time. This eviction was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of disregard, an audacity rooted in the assumption that I wouldn't act, that I wouldn't notice, that I would be powerless. I poured another cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands, and tried to trace the sequence of events that led here. I remembered conversations that seemed casual at the time, words dismissed lightly, requests ignored, moments when I had been passed over or underestimated. Each recollection sharpened my understanding. This wasn't about oversight. It was about testing limits, about seeing how far one could push without encountering resistance. And now, with the deed safely in my possession, I understood that the test was mine to answer, not with anger but with deliberate action. I walked to the study and pulled out a small notebook I had kept for years, filled with notes about expenses, repairs, and reminders about the property. The pages smelled faintly of paper and time, and as I flipped through them, I realized how much evidence of my dedication I had quietly collected. It was almost comical in its thoroughness, yet necessary. The people behind the eviction had assumed ignorance on my part, unaware that decades of care had been documented, archived, and stored for precisely this moment. I smiled faintly at the irony. The knowledge that I was prepared offered a small but potent comfort. The evening shadows lengthened, and the house seemed to hum with anticipation. I considered the confrontation that would come in the morning. Would they scoff at the deed? Pretend not to understand? Or would the reality of ownership finally break through their assumptions? I reviewed each scenario silently, imagining the disbelief on faces, the excuses, the attempts to spin the situation. But through each mental rehearsal, one truth remained constant. I held the ultimate proof, and no amount of arrogance could alter that fact. My confidence was no longer just in the document itself, but in the years of preparation that it represented. As I moved from room to room, memories of conversations with family surfaced again. I recalled moments when I had tried to mediate disputes, intervene in petty arguments, or guide relatives with advice that was quietly ignored. Each of those interactions had left an impression, a subtle thread of resentment or dismissiveness that now seemed to converge on this moment. The eviction was more than a legal maneuver. It was a culmination of personal disregard and underestimation. Recognizing this allowed me to approach the challenge not as an abstract obstacle but as a personal reckoning. I sat in the living room, staring at the faint scratches in the wooden floor where furniture had been moved countless times over the years. Each mark was a memory of effort, of endurance, of responsibility. And now, in those scratches, I found a strange comfort. They reminded me that even when invisible to others, my work had left a permanent imprint. Just like the floor, I had endured pressure, weight, and friction over time. And like the floor, I had not given way. That realization sparked a quiet determination. I would not be dismissed, underestimated, or displaced without response. My thoughts turned to strategy. Confrontation would require clarity and precision. I reviewed the plan I had been forming since the first reading of the eviction notice. Present the deed calmly. Allow disbelief to surface. Resist the urge to argue unnecessarily. Remain focused on the fact. Ownership was undeniable. The act of preparation was more than legal, it was psychological. Demonstrating knowledge, patience, and confidence would ensure that the lesson was as clear as the proof itself. I felt a rising sense of control, the kind that comes from knowing every move, anticipating every reaction, and understanding the full scope of one's position. The night grew colder, and I moved to the kitchen for one last cup of tea before settling into an armchair by the window. I watched the moonlight trace the outline of the yard, thinking of all the nights spent under its glow, repairing, planning, and preserving. The house had been my constant companion, bearing witness to both successes and disappointments, joys and minor indignities. Now it would witness something different. A moment of assertion, a quiet triumph over presumption and ignorance. I felt a mix of anticipation and calm, a strange combination that only comes from knowing you are fully prepared for a challenge that others have underestimated. Finally, I allowed myself a brief reflection on what this eviction attempt had revealed. People often assume that effort, consistency, and care are invisible or unimportant. The audacity of dismissal can sting deeply, but it also offers clarity. It exposes character, both in oneself and in others, and it highlights the necessity of preparation, foresight, and resolve. In the coming hours, as the confrontation unfolded, I would demonstrate that true ownership, whether of property or dignity, cannot be denied by assumption or oversight. I sat back, the deed resting securely in the drawer, and breathed slowly. The house was quiet, the tension still present, but tempered now with resolve. I had considered the past, anticipated the reactions, and embraced the responsibility of standing firm. The eviction notice had disrupted my peace, yes, but it had also illuminated the path forward. Tomorrow would demand focus, patience, and precision, but I felt ready. The house, my home, would not be taken lightly, and I was prepared to ensure that those who doubted me would witness the full measure of preparation, persistence, and undeniable truth. Morning arrived with a muted clarity that made the air feel heavy and expectant. I opened the front door cautiously, aware that today would be different. There was a certain weight in the silence outside, the way the light fell across the yard, how the wind carried no sound of the usual neighbors chatting. It felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. My hand lingered on the doorframe, feeling the familiar grooves of the wood under my fingers, and I realized how many times this threshold had been crossed in quiet moments of routine. Today, it would mark the entry into a conflict that had been silently brewing far longer than anyone outside these walls understood. I stepped outside, the deed securely in my coat pocket, and scanned the surroundings. The people attempting the eviction were late or perhaps cautious, aware that I was prepared. The absence of immediate confrontation gave me space to reflect on the dynamics at play. This was not just a matter of property. It was an exposure of assumptions, a test of character for everyone involved. The audacity to act without knowledge, to presume authority, revealed more about them than it did about me. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool air sharpen my thoughts, and reminded myself that the confrontation would require patience and precision. Every word, every gesture, had to convey the quiet certainty of truth. Memories of previous disagreements surfaced as I waited. Minor disputes, casual dismissals, and overlooked efforts now seemed like foreshadowing. Each encounter where my intentions had been questioned or disregarded now fit into a larger pattern. It wasn't just ignorance at play. It was a tendency to underestimate, to assume the absence of resistance. The eviction notice was merely the most overt expression of a subtle, long-standing dynamic. Recognizing this, I felt an odd mixture of frustration and empowerment. The frustration was natural, a response to injustice, but the empowerment came from knowing that preparedness and clarity would allow me to reclaim control. When the first car pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened. Not from fear, but from anticipation. A man in a suit emerged, carrying a clipboard, exuding confidence born from assumed authority. His eyes scanned the property, likely expecting compliance, quick resolution, and minimal resistance. I watched his approach carefully, noting the subtle tension in his gait, the casual way he carried himself as though he owned the space. My hand brushed the pocket where the deed rested, a quiet reminder that assumptions can be challenged by facts, and that appearances often conceal reality. I greeted him calmly, my voice steady despite the storm of thoughts behind it. He extended a form and began speaking, outlining the eviction process with practiced precision. I listened, nodding faintly, allowing him to speak fully before responding. This was a performance of patience, a demonstration of readiness. I would not rush or overreact. His tone suggested expectation of compliance, but I knew that compliance would come only on my terms, by presenting undeniable proof of ownership. Every sentence he uttered felt like a test, a probing of resolve, and I met it with measured calm. I asked a few clarifying questions, deliberately slow and pointed, to highlight that I understood the process and my rights. Each inquiry seemed to unsettle him slightly, the first sign that his confidence was encountering resistance. I could sense him recalibrating, realizing that his assumptions about ignorance and compliance might have been premature. It was not overt confrontation yet, but the tension had shifted. I held the advantage of knowledge and preparation, quietly asserting authority in a situation where appearances had suggested otherwise. Then came the moment to reveal the deed. I retrieved it from my coat, placing it deliberately on the table outside the house. The man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing his expression. He scanned the document, reading slowly, perhaps hoping for some flaw, some technicality that would invalidate its weight. There was none. Every line was precise, every signature accounted for. The confidence he had carried moments before seemed to waver, replaced by the realization that he had underestimated not only my awareness but the permanence of my claim. I watched him struggle with his response, the polite script he had memorized faltering. I refrained from commentary, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. His attempts to redirect the conversation or challenge the validity of the document fell flat against decades of preparation, recorded history, and legal clarity. It was almost a relief to see the confrontation unfold exactly as I had anticipated, a mixture of discomfort and recognition now apparent on his face. The power dynamic had shifted, not through anger or theatrics, but through calm assertion and undeniable proof. While he consulted his notes, I reflected on the broader lessons of the morning. Authority assumed is often authority unearned. People frequently act on presumptions rather than understanding. But preparation, diligence, and quiet persistence can transform moments of potential loss into demonstrations of resilience. This confrontation was a culmination of past patience, attention, and care, crystallized in a single, decisive act. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a confirmation that years of effort and foresight could not be dismissed. The house, my home, bore witness to this reality, validating both ownership and the integrity of my actions. The man finally spoke again, hesitating, attempting a cautious negotiation or acknowledgement. His words were careful, calculated, yet I recognized that the essential recognition had already been established. Ownership, verified and indisputable, had changed the tone of the encounter. The eviction, once looming as a threat, now seemed inconsequential in comparison to the broader assertion of dignity, respect, and rightful authority. I realized that confrontation need not be loud or aggressive to succeed. Sometimes the quiet demonstration of truth is the most compelling force of all. As he left, the tension gradually ebbed, leaving a mixture of relief and lingering reflection. I closed the door behind him, returning to the quiet embrace of the house. The morning's events reinforced lessons about vigilance, persistence, and the often overlooked value of preparation. It also underscored the importance of self-respect, that even in the face of audacity and presumption, one can assert boundaries firmly, calmly, and successfully. I moved through the rooms, sensing the house's quiet acknowledgement, and felt a profound connection between space, effort, and the assertion of rightful ownership. Finally, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, the deed safely tucked back in its place. The confrontation had passed, but its impact lingered, shaping a renewed understanding of what it means to defend one's life, one's work, and one's dignity. I realized that this experience was not merely about property. It was about asserting presence, challenging assumptions, and honoring the quiet, consistent effort that often goes unnoticed. And in that understanding, there was a profound sense of empowerment, a calm awareness that preparation and perseverance could withstand even the most audacious challenges. The confrontation had ended, but the echo of it lingered in the quiet corners of the house. I moved slowly through each room, noticing details I had long taken for granted. The chipped paint on the hallway trim, the soft creak of the stairs, the faint smell of old wood and sunlight. These small reminders grounded me, connecting past efforts to present affirmation. For years, I had maintained this space not just for shelter, but as a testament to persistence and responsibility. Today, that work had become a shield and a statement. I realized that ownership was more than a legal claim. It was the recognition of what one had endured, preserved, and defended. I paused at the window, watching the neighborhood wake in slow, ordinary rhythms. Neighbors passing by, unaware of the drama that had unfolded, carried on as if nothing had changed. That normalcy highlighted the quiet intensity of what had just occurred. The eviction attempt had been an intrusion, a momentary upheaval, but it now seemed almost trivial compared to the broader lessons it had revealed. Respect, I understood, is not given lightly. It is earned, defended, and asserted with calm authority. The deed had been a tool, yes, but the preparation, foresight, and patience that accompanied it had been the true measure of power. Memories surfaced of past moments when my authority and effort were questioned, dismissed, or overlooked. Family members who assumed ignorance, colleagues who undervalued contributions, even friends who underestimated resolve. All of it converged in this morning's confrontation. Each memory was a subtle thread that wove the present tension into a larger tapestry of experience. I realized that these challenges had prepared me, quietly and consistently, for moments that demanded composure and clarity. The eviction attempt, which might have overwhelmed someone less prepared, became a demonstration of foresight, strategy, and patience. I took a seat in the living room, letting the soft sunlight wash over the furniture. The house felt unusually alive, not from noise, but from the presence of my reflection in its history. Each creak, each shadow, seemed to carry a story of resilience, of quiet victories, and of small, persistent acts that had gone unnoticed by many. I understood now that the emotional weight of defending one's space often surpassed the legal or material dimensions of ownership. It was the affirmation of self, the acknowledgement that one's efforts could not be dismissed or overridden. The phone rang briefly, startling me out of my thoughts. A relative had called, unaware of the morning's events, inquiring casually about everyday matters. I answered, speaking with calm composure, letting the conversation unfold naturally. It struck me how ordinary interactions often mask extraordinary undercurrents. While the legal and logistical aspects of ownership had been addressed, the social and emotional ramifications continued to ripple outward. Each interaction now carried a subtle tension. Acknowledgement of authority, recognition of preparation, and awareness that assumptions about ignorance were no longer valid. I reflected on how often life places one in positions where quiet effort is invisible. Yet decisive moments expose that effort in full clarity. The eviction attempt had been abrupt, but it revealed a larger pattern. Respect and authority are frequently tested, challenged, or assumed absent. Through calm persistence, meticulous preparation, and an unwavering sense of self, I had transformed a potential loss into affirmation. This understanding extended beyond the property itself. It touched every facet of how one navigates life's challenges, asserting dignity and establishing boundaries with subtle but firm certainty. As afternoon approached, I walked through the garden, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin and the soft unevenness of the soil beneath my feet. I recalled planting those flowers and tending to the lawn, small acts of care that seemed inconsequential at the time but now symbolized long-term investment and persistence. The eviction had been an affront, yet in these familiar actions, I found calm and reassurance. Physical work, attention to detail and continuity in care created a foundation of resilience that could withstand abrupt challenges and external assumptions. Sitting on the porch, I considered how the morning's events might change the perception of my household. Those who attempted the eviction would now have to recalibrate their assumptions, acknowledging not only the deed itself but the preparation, persistence, and vigilance that ensured its impact. Authority, I realized, is often relational and psychological as much as it is legal. By maintaining composure and demonstrating knowledge, I had shifted not only the external conflict but also the underlying perception of competence and control. The house was no longer merely a structure. It had become a stage where quiet resolve asserted itself. Evening shadows began to stretch across the yard, softening the edges of the day and inviting reflection. I thought about the subtle lessons embedded in confrontation. That preparation often outlasts aggression, that knowledge can transform tension into clarity, and that dignity is maintained not by reaction but by measured, deliberate action. The morning had tested patience, composure, and strategic thinking, and the successful outcome reaffirmed that these qualities were invaluable, not just in defending property but in navigating life's ongoing challenges. Finally, I allowed a moment of gratitude to settle over me, not for the eviction attempt itself, but for the opportunity it provided to demonstrate resilience, preparation, and self-respect. It underscored the importance of being attentive to long-term responsibility, to documenting and preserving efforts that may not always be recognized immediately. Life often presents moments that reveal the cumulative power of persistence, and today had been one of those moments. I felt a quiet, confident satisfaction, grounded in the awareness that diligence and careful planning could overcome audacity, assumption, and oversight. The house had settled into an uneasy quiet after the morning's confrontation, but I knew the tension was far from gone. Even with the legal victory clear, family dynamics are rarely so simple. I could feel the weight of unspoken resentment and unacknowledged assumptions hovering in the corners, subtle but persistent. It was the kind of silence that isn't restful. It hums with potential conflict, waiting for the smallest spark. I walked from room to room, noting again the marks of time and effort that the deed represented. Each board, each shelf, each creak of the floor reminded me that ownership is more than paper. It is lived, endured, and defended through decades of quiet labor and vigilance. I remembered conversations from years ago, when my family had questioned my choices, assumed I lacked understanding, or dismissed my judgment outright. Those small moments of disregard, at the time nearly imperceptible, had accumulated into a layered awareness of how I was perceived. Today's attempt to evict me hadn't come from nowhere. It was the latest manifestation of a recurring pattern, an assumption that I was passive, uninformed, or incapable of asserting authority. That realization gave the confrontation a sharper edge. I wasn't merely defending a house. I was confronting a history of oversight, entitlement, and disregard that had quietly accumulated over decades. Sitting at the kitchen table, I reflected on the early mornings and long evenings spent maintaining the property. Each decision, whether repairing the plumbing, planting the garden, or negotiating with service providers, was part of a larger story of diligence and accountability. These tasks had always seemed ordinary, almost invisible in their repetition. But now they were part of the evidence of my foresight, my capacity to maintain control over what I had earned and nurtured. The deed might have been the legal tool, but the day-to-day labor was the foundation that made it meaningful. Without the sustained care, the paper alone would have meant nothing. The eviction attempt would have succeeded if I hadn't invested not just money, but patience and insight. The phone rang again, this time a distant cousin checking in after hearing rumors of the morning's events. Their voice was casual, but there was a subtle edge of curiosity and caution. I answered, allowing the conversation to flow naturally while observing my own response. The act of speaking with composure, of communicating calmly and clearly, reinforced the quiet authority that had emerged during the confrontation. People often underestimate the psychological power of presence, the way one carries certainty, preparation, and self-respect. Today, I had exercised that power, and I sensed it had shifted others' perceptions, if only incrementally. Later, as afternoon sunlight filled the living room, I began to consider the ripple effects. How would family members recalibrate their assumptions about me now? Would they recognize that readiness, knowledge, and foresight are sometimes more potent than force or loud assertion? I could imagine conversations behind closed doors, a mixture of surprise, respect, and perhaps begrudging acknowledgement. This reflection reminded me that battles are rarely contained to the immediate moment. The smallest act of preparedness can influence perceptions, relationships, and even long-term power dynamics within a family. The memories of past dismissals surfaced again, this time tinged with clarity. Every time my advice was ignored, every time my contributions were undervalued, it had been a subtle preparation for the day when I would need to assert authority decisively. The eviction attempt, though abrupt, had become a culmination of those experiences, an opportunity to demonstrate the depth of understanding and resilience that had been underestimated for so long. I realized that patience and quiet vigilance often outlast impulsive challenges. By maintaining calm, observing carefully, and acting with intention, I had preserved not only my property but also the recognition of my competence and foresight. I walked into the study, running my hand across the worn surface of the desk that had been part of my daily routine for years. Papers, ledgers, and notes reminded me of the countless decisions, negotiations, and careful planning that had gone into safeguarding both the house and my sense of responsibility. These tangible records mirrored the intangible accumulation of experience and foresight. In that moment, I understood that my authority was validated not through confrontation alone, but through the steady, consistent investment of time, effort, and thought. The eviction attempt had tested this, but it could not undo it. As evening approached, I stepped outside into the garden. The flowers I had tended, the soil I had nurtured, even the uneven patches of lawn carried stories of persistence and resilience. Looking at them, I felt a quiet sense of continuity, a reminder that the outcomes of long-term effort often become visible at unexpected moments. The confrontation was one such moment, a flashpoint that revealed not only the immediate tension, but also the deep-rooted history of preparation and endurance. I realized that life often presents these tests, and our responses to them define the narrative of our authority, dignity, and self-respect. Sitting on the porch, watching shadows lengthen across the yard, I thought about the lessons embedded in the day's events. Patience, foresight, and persistence had triumphed over assumptions, audacity, and neglect. Authority and respect are not merely demanded. They are cultivated over time and demonstrated when challenged. The eviction attempt had been a disruption, but it also became a confirmation of competence, foresight, and dignity. That understanding brought with it a quiet satisfaction, the recognition that persistence and careful attention could safeguard not only property but the recognition of one's worth and effort. I lingered on these reflections well into the evening, considering the interplay of legal, emotional, and social dynamics. Ownership is rarely solely about legal title. It encompasses the recognition of long-term effort, resilience, and preparedness. The eviction attempt had tested each of these dimensions simultaneously, exposing weaknesses for those who attempted to overreach and confirming strengths for those who had anticipated challenges with care and foresight. I realized that this day, though stressful and confrontational, would serve as a pivotal reference point for understanding the interplay of authority, respect, and persistence in every subsequent family interaction. Even as the initial confrontation settled into quiet, I sensed that the day was far from over. There was a lingering weight in the rooms, the kind that speaks louder than words. I realized that some family members were watching closely, trying to gauge whether my calm was genuine or simply a temporary defense. That awareness added a subtle tension to every interaction. It wasn't just about the legal victory anymore. It was about perception, about proving that years of experience, vigilance, and quiet determination were not to be underestimated. I had won the first battle, but the war for understanding and respect within my family was still ongoing. I remembered a conversation from years ago with a trusted friend, someone who had always encouraged me to anticipate challenges rather than react impulsively. Their advice had felt almost mundane at the time, but now it seemed prophetic. The eviction attempt had been a catalyst, but my readiness, born from careful planning and foresight, had made the outcome inevitable. It struck me that preparation is often invisible until the moment of truth reveals its value. I reflected on the countless small acts of diligence that had accumulated over the years, paying bills on time, repairing the house before issues became crises, negotiating quietly with neighbors and contractors. All those small efforts had created the foundation that made this confrontation survivable, even manageable. By late afternoon, one of the cousins I hadn't spoken with in years arrived unexpectedly. Their presence was subtle, almost cautious, yet it carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. We talked quietly in the kitchen, away from the others, and I realized that some family members had quietly noticed the repeated attempts to undermine me over time. They weren't outspoken, but they understood that the deeds, the legal documents, and the careful attention to detail were not merely procedural. They were evidence of capability and foresight. Their acknowledgement, quiet as it was, felt like a small victory. Sometimes allies appear in the most unexpected places, and their support, even if unspoken, can shift the dynamics of conflict more than overt confrontation ever could. While the conversation continued, I thought back to other moments of subtle betrayal within the family. Not grand gestures, but small slights and assumptions that I would not notice or that I would forgive silently. Those patterns had repeated enough times to create an unspoken hierarchy, one where I was underestimated, my opinions discounted, my authority challenged. The eviction attempt was simply the most overt expression of that pattern, but the underlying dynamics had been developing for decades. I realized that recognition is not always immediate, but persistent competence eventually becomes undeniable, even if grudgingly accepted. I wandered back into the living room, my fingers tracing the edges of old furniture, each piece with its own story. I thought about the long evenings spent reviewing documents, ensuring that the house would remain in my hands no matter what schemes or assumptions others might entertain. The legal paper had been crucial, yes, but it was the accumulation of patience, attention, and experience that had truly fortified my position. The eviction attempt was a test of both my preparedness and my composure, and I had passed. I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, though I knew the emotional aftermath would require continued navigation. The evening settled in with a quiet intensity. I realized that family dynamics, like property, require ongoing maintenance. Respect is earned and reinforced over time, not merely demanded through a single act of confrontation. I reflected on the power of subtle influence, the ability to demonstrate capability without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Sometimes, the quietest acts speak the loudest. Reviewing documents meticulously, responding calmly under pressure, and letting others reveal their misunderstandings through their own actions. These were the tools that had protected me today, and they would continue to guide my interactions moving forward. Later, I received a text from one of the more distant relatives, acknowledging the situation and expressing admiration for how I had handled it. Though brief, it struck me as validation of the quiet authority I had cultivated over the years. It reinforced the realization that preparation, composure, and consistency often outweigh volume and force. The recognition from someone who had observed the patterns over time carried more meaning than any immediate applause. It reminded me that family dynamics are complex and multi-layered. Victories are rarely purely legal or procedural. They are social, emotional, and perceptual as well. By the time night fell, I was alone on the porch again, the garden bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. I let my thoughts wander over the events of the day, considering the long-term consequences of what had transpired. The eviction attempt had been a direct challenge, yes, but it also became a demonstration of resilience and foresight. I understood that my role in the family, though often underestimated, had been quietly affirmed through both action and restraint. My ability to navigate tension, maintain composure, and anticipate challenges had transformed a potentially humiliating moment into one of subtle triumph. I thought about the future, about how conversations and interactions might shift in the coming days. Family members who had assumed ignorance or passivity would have to reconsider their assumptions. Those who had doubted my judgment would now have tangible evidence of preparedness, calm authority, and strategic foresight. The eviction attempt had forced a confrontation with not only immediate challenges but also with long-standing dynamics of power and respect. I realized that some battles are less about winning outright and more about redefining how one is perceived and understood. The night deepened, and I allowed myself to reflect on a quiet satisfaction. Today had been both a test and a revelation. While the legalities had provided a protective shield, it was my accumulated knowledge, foresight, and steady composure that truly defined the outcome. The eviction attempt had revealed the assumptions of others, tested my patience, and ultimately confirmed my authority. I understood, more clearly than ever, that resilience is often invisible until it is called upon, and recognition is most powerful when it is earned through consistency, preparation, and quiet courage. Finally, I settled into a chair by the window, looking out at the property that had been my life's work. I considered how the events of today would ripple outward, how perceptions would shift, and how subtle influence could reshape family dynamics over time. The eviction attempt, though dramatic, had been only a moment in a much larger narrative. A narrative defined by foresight, patience, and enduring commitment. I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had anticipated conflict, met it with dignity, and emerged with both the property and the respect long denied now secured. The morning arrived with a peculiar stillness, the kind that feels heavy with anticipation. I could sense that today, even more than yesterday, would test not just my legal standing but the quiet authority I had fought to establish within the family. As I moved through the kitchen preparing my coffee, I thought about the subtle ways relationships shift after confrontations. Some bonds strengthen, others fracture. It was impossible to predict, and yet, there was a strange clarity in the uncertainty. I knew that patience would be my ally, and composure my shield. Later, a knock at the door brought a cousin I hadn't expected. Their arrival seemed casual, but the look in their eyes suggested they had come with a purpose. We spoke quietly in the living room, their tone tentative yet curious. I realized they had been observing the tensions for years but never intervened, perhaps unsure of their place in the family hierarchy. Today, however, they seemed ready to acknowledge what had always been true. I had been underestimated, but my diligence and foresight had quietly demonstrated my competence. That silent recognition, delivered through subtle words and glances, carried a weight far greater than any argument could. The conversation shifted toward the eviction attempt, and I explained, calmly but firmly, how carefully I had managed every detail of the property. It was not a boast but a statement of fact. I could see their surprise, the realization settling in that my authority was not arbitrary. It was earned through decades of attention, effort, and quiet vigilance. They admitted they had suspected the worst from some family members, who often assumed that I would not notice or defend my position. Yet the truth was evident now, and even unspoken, it reshaped the dynamics of trust and respect. As we talked, I reflected on the other family members who had tried to undermine me. Their tactics had been subtle but persistent. Small demands, questions about my decisions, insinuations that I had been careless or inattentive. The eviction attempt was simply the most visible expression of a long-standing pattern. I realized that recognition from those who had remained silent was just as important as the legal victory. It reinforced the understanding that patience, observation, and strategic response could have a more profound impact than confrontation alone. By mid-afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. A neighbor who had known my family for decades. They spoke candidly about the rumors that had circulated regarding the house, about the assumption that I might falter under pressure. Their words were not meant to flatter but to offer perspective. The eviction attempt had revealed not only the intentions of others but also the resilience and competence I had demonstrated. It struck me that reputation, built quietly over years, often carries more influence than any single document or confrontation. As the day unfolded, I realized that alliances, both old and newly acknowledged, were forming subtly. The cousin and neighbor's quiet support demonstrated that validation can appear in unexpected ways. These moments of recognition did not require public fanfare. They were measured, thoughtful, and grounded in observation. I thought back to earlier betrayals and misunderstandings, recognizing that even those who had doubted me might, over time, come to respect the consistency and care I had applied to every aspect of the house and its management. In the late afternoon, I received a message from a distant relative who had been skeptical about my ability to handle the eviction. Their words were cautious, acknowledging the misjudgment in underestimating my preparedness and composure. It was a reminder that family dynamics often operate in layers, with misperceptions persisting until concrete actions reveal the truth. This message, while brief, felt like a turning point. The acknowledgement of competence, even if delayed, was a form of resolution in its own right. Later, I walked through the house, inspecting corners and rooms I had long maintained with care. The familiar spaces offered a sense of continuity amid the upheaval, and I reflected on how physical stewardship mirrored the attention I had given to relationships within the family. Control over the home was not merely a matter of legal right but of consistent diligence and care. Every repair, every careful decision, had prepared me for moments like today, when subtlety and foresight proved far more powerful than overt confrontation. As the evening approached, I gathered the family members who remained in the house for a quiet conversation. I did not confront or accuse. Instead, I recounted the sequence of events calmly, highlighting the importance of respect, attention, and diligence. Their reactions varied. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others were silent, but the underlying message was received. Authority, I realized, is often established through consistency and example rather than loud assertion. This calm approach shifted perceptions more effectively than any argument or display of dominance could have. Night fell, and I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the day's revelations. The eviction attempt, once a source of anxiety, had become an opportunity for subtle reaffirmation. It revealed weaknesses, highlighted alliances, and demonstrated resilience. I understood that influence within a family is rarely immediate. It accumulates through consistent action, quiet strength, and strategic patience. Today had provided a clear illustration of that truth. Finally, I considered the road ahead. The family dynamics would continue to evolve, and misunderstandings might resurface. Yet, I felt equipped to handle future challenges, armed with experience, composure, and the recognition of those who had quietly observed and understood. The eviction attempt, while dramatic, had revealed not just the intentions of others, but also my own ability to navigate tension, assert boundaries, and cultivate respect. It had transformed an immediate conflict into a broader lesson about influence, foresight, and quiet power. The morning light felt heavier than usual as I prepared to face the family members who had orchestrated the eviction attempt. The house was quiet, almost expectant, as if it too anticipated the confrontation to come. I sipped my coffee slowly, reflecting on the subtle tensions that had been simmering for weeks. The disruption introduced in the previous days, the knock of doubt, the insinuations that I lacked vigilance, still lingered in my mind. But today, I would address it directly, without anger or theatrics, relying solely on the clarity of facts and the quiet authority I had cultivated over the years. I invited the remaining family members to sit in the living room. Their hesitation was palpable, each glance carrying a mixture of guilt, defensiveness, and curiosity. I started by recounting the sequence of events leading to the eviction notice, deliberately choosing measured words that neither accused nor exaggerated. My voice, calm but firm, carried the weight of someone who had observed, prepared, and understood every step of the conflict. I noticed subtle shifts in their posture, shoulders relaxing, eyes widening, as they began to grasp the reality of the situation. As I explained the ownership of the deed, I emphasized the practical steps I had taken to ensure everything was in order. There was no boast, only a careful presentation of the truth. Every signature, every document, every minor oversight by others had been accounted for. The tension in the room was tangible, yet it was laced with a reluctant acknowledgement that my foresight had prevented chaos. The irony was not lost on me. Those who had attempted to challenge my authority were now quietly realizing how thorough and prepared I had been. One of them finally spoke, a cousin who had previously remained silent. Their words were tentative, tinged with both apology and surprise. They admitted to underestimating my diligence and foresight, acknowledging that their assumptions about my inattention had been wrong. I listened, nodding, allowing the statement to settle in the room. Silence followed, but it was not heavy. It was reflective, almost cleansing, as if the air itself recognized a shift in family dynamics. I took this moment to introduce a subtle yet powerful lesson. Authority and respect are not granted automatically. They are cultivated through consistent action, attention to detail, and calm resilience. I recounted moments where small, careful decisions had protected the house, preserved relationships, and prevented unnecessary escalation. Each example was a quiet testament to the importance of diligence over confrontation, planning over reaction. My audience, though initially resistant, began to absorb the lesson, their expressions softening as comprehension replaced defensiveness. Throughout the conversation, I noticed that some family members had their eyes on each other, realizing that assumptions had fueled misunderstandings. The eviction attempt was not just an attack on me. It had revealed a deeper pattern of miscommunication, entitlement, and oversight that had persisted quietly for years. By presenting the facts without anger, I allowed the truth to stand on its own, exposing both the errors in judgment and the potential for reconciliation. It was a rare moment of collective reflection, and I could feel the subtle shift in energy around the room. The discussion naturally turned toward the future. I outlined my expectations for mutual respect, clear communication, and acknowledgement of responsibilities. There was no need for threats or ultimatums. The recognition of my preparedness and the clarity of the legal standing were sufficient to enforce boundaries. I sensed that the confrontation, while difficult, had transformed into an opportunity for setting long-term expectations. The room was tense but composed, a dynamic that reflected both the gravity of past actions and the hope for future understanding. Later, as the conversation concluded, I invited questions and clarifications. Each query was answered calmly, ensuring that no confusion remained. I observed the quiet surprise on their faces, the realization that the eviction attempt had not just failed but had inadvertently reinforced my credibility and authority. Their understanding was subtle, nonverbal, yet deeply perceptible. In this moment, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from dominance, but from the acknowledgement that truth, preparation, and resilience could triumph over doubt and manipulation. By evening, the house felt different. The invisible lines of respect had been redrawn, not through argument but through demonstration. Those who had tried to challenge me now carried a new awareness of my capabilities and foresight. The conflict had not escalated into anger or resentment. Instead, it had catalyzed a deeper understanding of family dynamics, responsibilities, and the silent power of preparedness. I walked through the halls, noting small signs of acknowledgement in their behavior, subtle gestures, quiet attention, and a newfound willingness to listen. I reflected on the irony that the eviction attempt, meant to diminish me, had instead solidified my position. My authority, previously assumed by some as fragile, now rested on a foundation of undeniable competence. The confrontation had served not only to correct misjudgments but also to provide a model of measured response, patience, and calm leadership. I felt a sense of quiet triumph, rooted not in vengeance but in the fulfillment of responsibility and the establishment of boundaries that would endure. Night fell and the house seemed at peace. I considered the broader implications of the day's events. The understanding that family conflict, when navigated with clarity and restraint, can lead to lasting respect and recalibrated relationships. The eviction attempt had revealed both weaknesses and strengths, misjudgments and foresight, doubt and validation. I felt equipped to handle future challenges with the same composure, knowing that preparation and quiet authority could resolve even the most tense confrontations. The day ended with a quiet sense of resolution. The eviction, once a looming threat, had become a catalyst for affirmation. My control over the property was now beyond question, but more importantly, my role within the family had been subtly redefined. Those who had doubted me had witnessed firsthand the strength that comes from diligence, foresight, and calm reflection. The confrontation had not only clarified ownership, but had also illuminated the deeper truths of respect, responsibility, and resilience within the family. The morning after the confrontation, I walked through the quiet rooms of the house, listening to the subtle echoes of yesterday's tension. The air felt lighter, though the weight of unspoken acknowledgement lingered. I knew the family had seen the truth of my preparation, but I also understood that respect is rarely instantaneous. It unfolds slowly, in glances, gestures, and tentative conversations. I reflected on the eviction attempt and how it had been rooted not in malice alone but in assumption and miscommunication. That realization brought a bittersweet awareness of how fragile familial trust can be. I decided to approach the day deliberately, not with arrogance but with steady presence. I prepared breakfast and left it on the table where a few family members gathered. The act was small, almost mundane, yet it carried meaning. A reminder that ownership of the house was not just about legal deeds, but about the life built within its walls. I noticed subtle nods of acknowledgement and quiet smiles that betrayed a growing understanding. This was the unspoken reconciliation in motion, a recognition that preparation, patience, and calm authority could resolve more than conflict. It could reshape relationships. Later, as conversations began to flow, I observed their hesitancy giving way to cautious engagement. My eldest niece brought up a topic unrelated to the eviction but sensitive nonetheless: the family garden, which had been neglected for years. She asked my opinion about plans to revive it, showing a willingness to involve me in decision-making. It was a small but significant gesture, reflecting that authority and respect were now being restored incrementally. I offered guidance, careful to remain calm and inclusive rather than commanding. The discussion became collaborative, a subtle affirmation that the day's confrontation had reframed the way we interacted. Throughout the afternoon, I reflected on the patterns that had led to the eviction attempt. I thought about how assumptions, when left unchecked, can fester into misjudgments and betrayal. I realized that my response, calm, prepared, and fact-driven, had done more than halt an immediate threat. It had demonstrated the importance of evidence over emotion, foresight over reaction, and dignity over confrontation. Each interaction throughout the day subtly reinforced these principles. My family members, previously wary or dismissive, were now beginning to internalize them. At one point, a cousin who had initially been vocal in supporting the eviction attempt approached me quietly. His tone was subdued, a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. He asked about the process I had followed to confirm ownership of the deed and ensure all legal matters were in order. I explained in measured detail, focusing on clarity and practical steps. His eyes widened in appreciation, and he offered a sincere, if tentative, apology. It was a moment of personal vindication, but more importantly, it demonstrated the effectiveness of restraint and preparation in resolving conflict. The afternoon shadows lengthened, and I found myself alone in the study. I reflected on the subtle psychological shifts occurring around me. The house had become a stage for learning, for quiet observation, and for the recognition of competence. The eviction attempt, which had initially felt like a violation of trust, now seemed like a turning point, a catalyst for maturity and renewed family understanding. I considered the irony that those who sought to displace me had inadvertently contributed to a deeper acknowledgement of my diligence and foresight. During dinner, the conversations flowed with more ease than they had in weeks. The family discussed plans for the coming weeks, including shared responsibilities for maintenance and household projects. There was an unspoken agreement that boundaries had been clarified, that authority had been acknowledged, and that past tensions would be managed more thoughtfully. I felt a quiet satisfaction not born of triumph over others but from the restoration of respect and the beginning of measured collaboration. The house, once a space of contested ownership, now felt subtly aligned with my presence and guidance. In the evening, I stepped outside to the garden. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. I paused, thinking about how the day had transformed the energy of the household. The eviction attempt had tested not just legal ownership but my patience, resilience, and capacity for measured response. In reflecting on the events, I recognized a personal growth that paralleled the external resolution. I had navigated confrontation without yielding to anger, demonstrated preparedness without arrogance, and restored authority without dominance. Later, as the house quieted for the night, I noticed the small gestures that marked change. A door left open in consideration, a chair offered without prompt, a glance that conveyed understanding. These moments were unspoken acknowledgments of respect, the silent rewards of consistent integrity and foresight. I reflected on how fragile such dynamics can be, but also how powerful quiet leadership and composure are in fostering long-term harmony. The eviction attempt had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also catalyzed recognition and growth, both within myself and across the family. Before retiring, I wrote a brief note in my journal, a reflection on the day's events. I chronicled the confrontation, the reactions, the lessons, and the subtle reconciliations. Writing allowed me to process not just what had happened, but how the experience had shifted the emotional landscape of the household. I acknowledged both the fragility and the resilience of familial bonds, the delicate balance between authority and understanding, and the quiet power of preparation and dignity. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of closure for the immediate conflict, but also a readiness for ongoing vigilance. Ownership, respect, and trust are not static. They require continual attention, reflection, and measured action. The eviction attempt had been a test, one I had navigated successfully, and it had revealed both challenges and opportunities. I understood that the family dynamic would continue to evolve, but I felt confident that the lessons of patience, clarity, and quiet authority would endure. Finally, as night fully settled, I walked through the home once more, appreciating the tangible and intangible markers of restored equilibrium. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had also illuminated paths to lasting respect and recalibrated relationships. I felt a renewed sense of calm and empowerment, the knowledge that preparedness, integrity, and measured response could navigate even the most tense family conflicts. The house, my home, and the family within it now reflected the resilience and dignity that had guided me throughout this journey. The days that followed the eviction confrontation brought subtle yet profound shifts in the household. I noticed that interactions which had once been tense or dismissive were now more measured. Family members approached me with questions rather than assumptions, their tone reflecting a newfound acknowledgement of my presence and authority. It was remarkable how quickly dynamics could change when patience and preparedness met confrontation head-on. I realized that respect, once taken for granted, often needed demonstration through consistent, calm leadership. I spent the mornings walking through the house, observing small changes. A curtain drawn differently, a plant repositioned, or dishes left neatly on the counter. These were quiet gestures, almost imperceptible, yet they signaled attention to detail and awareness of the household's shared environment. I interpreted them as subtle acknowledgments that the home was under my care, that decisions I made mattered, and that the family had begun internalizing the lessons from the eviction attempt. These small shifts were far more satisfying than any verbal acknowledgement. They were tangible proof that authority and dignity had been restored. During one afternoon, my son approached me with hesitance. His expression was conflicted, a mixture of regret and curiosity. He asked about certain legal details regarding the house, and I explained them step by step. There was no defensiveness in my tone, only clarity and patience. By focusing on explanation rather than judgment, I noticed his posture relax and his questions become genuine inquiries rather than veiled challenges. It was a moment of quiet reconciliation, not a dramatic gesture, but one that carried long-term implications for how he would approach interactions with me going forward. I reflected on how much of the tension had been rooted in assumptions. The eviction attempt, I realized, had been fueled by miscommunication and incomplete understanding of the facts. Once the deed had been clarified, the underlying issue was less about ownership and more about respect and recognition. I thought about the irony. The very act intended to assert control over the house had become the catalyst for teaching humility, patience, and attentive engagement. The family was learning that authority is not only about legal standing but about presence, foresight, and quiet confidence. Later that evening, a cousin who had previously aligned with the eviction attempt came by to discuss a community project we had planned for the garden. He spoke with genuine interest, asking for my guidance and showing attentiveness to my suggestions. This shift from opposition to collaboration was subtle but meaningful. It demonstrated that the confrontation had reframed relationships. Authority had been recognized, and the family had begun to approach me with a sense of partnership rather than assumption or defiance. I realized that the long-term effect of such conflicts often depends more on follow-through than on the confrontation itself. I also noticed a gradual change in the way the younger generation interacted with me. Where there had once been casual disregard or impatience, there was now attentiveness and respect. They asked questions about how I had managed the house, inquired about maintenance tips, and sought my opinion on small decisions. These moments were delicate, almost imperceptible acknowledgments of the authority I had always held but had been overlooked. It was gratifying to witness the subtle ways respect can manifest without drama, gestures that reflected genuine understanding rather than obligation. At night, I reflected on my own journey throughout the ordeal. I recognized that my patience, preparation, and calm demeanor had not only preserved the house but had also served as a model for the family. I considered how many conflicts escalate when assumptions go unchallenged or when authority is asserted impulsively. By maintaining composure and demonstrating knowledge without aggression, I had transformed what could have been a fracturing event into a subtle education in mutual respect. The household felt steadier, more cohesive, and, importantly, more attentive to each individual's responsibilities. During another afternoon, I overheard a conversation among the cousins discussing the house and its upkeep. Their tone had shifted from casual dismissiveness to thoughtful engagement. They spoke about tasks in a cooperative tone and included consideration for my perspective. It was a reminder that respect is not simply declared. It is observed, internalized, and acted upon. I felt a quiet pride in knowing that my measured response had fostered this transformation, and I reflected on how often small, consistent actions have more lasting effects than dramatic confrontations. In parallel, I began encouraging small family meetings, casual conversations around household matters, and opportunities for collaborative problem-solving. These sessions were framed not as instruction but as inclusion, giving family members the space to contribute while subtly reinforcing my presence and guidance. The transition from confrontation to cooperation was ongoing, but the family's responsiveness suggested that these efforts were working. It became clear that restoring trust and respect is a continuous process, reinforced through consistent engagement rather than episodic authority displays. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I observed a small but telling sign. My niece quietly tending to the garden without being prompted. It reminded me that influence often manifests in the unspoken, that lessons of respect and responsibility can take root quietly and bloom over time. The eviction attempt, which had seemed like a moment of crisis, now appeared as a pivotal turning point that had reshaped relationships and dynamics more profoundly than I could have anticipated. I wrote in my journal before bed, noting these subtle transformations. I recorded conversations, gestures, and shifts in demeanor, recognizing the cumulative effect of patience, clarity, and quiet authority. The house was no longer merely a physical space. It had become a living testament to resilience, foresight, and dignity. I reflected on how even moments of confrontation can yield constructive outcomes when approached thoughtfully, and I felt reassured that the lessons of respect and responsibility would endure long beyond the immediate crisis. Finally, I reflected on the contrast between the chaos of the eviction attempt and the calm of the present household. The change was not dramatic or immediate but gradual, subtle, and authentic. I understood that authority is reinforced not by confrontation alone but by consistent, deliberate presence, by demonstrating competence, and by modeling the behaviors expected of others. The family, once poised for conflict, was now navigating interactions with awareness, respect, and collaboration. It was a slow, careful transformation, but one that promised long-term harmony. As I closed my journal and looked around the quiet rooms, I realized that the eviction attempt had done more than test my patience or legal preparedness. It had created a space for reflection, growth, and recalibration of family dynamics. The subtle changes in behavior, attitude, and engagement were proof that measured response, clarity, and persistence could restore balance and respect even after moments of betrayal. I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction in knowing that resilience and dignity had prevailed. The weekend arrived, bringing with it an unexpected opportunity to observe the household in its new rhythm. I had planned a small gathering, a casual weekend breakfast, mostly to enjoy a quiet moment and gauge how the subtle shifts over the past weeks were settling in. I noticed immediately that the energy felt different. Conversations were warmer, gestures more intentional, and there was a sense of attentiveness that had been absent before the eviction confrontation. It struck me that while the legal resolution had been the catalyst, the real transformation was happening quietly in everyday interactions. As I set the table, I observed my children moving around the kitchen without prompting. My son, who had been most vocal during the eviction attempt, paused to ask whether I needed help with the coffee, and his tone carried genuine consideration rather than obligation. My daughter-in-law, previously dismissive in her casual remarks, paused in her own preparations to ask for my opinion on seating arrangements. These small but deliberate acts signaled an understanding that my role in the household was not merely legal or symbolic. It was central to the way the family functioned. Their attentiveness, though subtle, was a testament to the change that had taken place. I reflected on how much effort had been required to reach this point. It wasn't a single dramatic gesture that had shifted the family's dynamic, but a series of patient, measured responses and consistent demonstrations of authority balanced with empathy. The eviction confrontation had been the spark, yes, but the sustained effort to model composure, fairness, and clarity had allowed respect to emerge organically. Watching them navigate the space with awareness of my presence gave me a quiet sense of fulfillment. During breakfast, I noticed a moment that felt particularly revealing. My youngest cousin, who had been passive in previous discussions about the house, spontaneously offered to refill my coffee. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but in the context of weeks of tension, it represented an acknowledgement of both my authority and my value within the family unit. I responded with a quiet smile, noting the importance of reinforcing positive behavior through acknowledgement rather than criticism. The subtle lesson seemed to resonate, and I felt a surge of pride that was understated but deeply satisfying. As the morning progressed, conversation drifted to plans for a community project, a garden renovation that had been on hold for months. I observed how family members now actively sought my input and respected my suggestions. Where there had once been casual disregard, there was now careful listening and collaborative discussion. It became clear that the confrontation over the eviction had reshaped relationships more profoundly than I had anticipated. Authority and respect were no longer enforced through tension or conflict. They had become integrated into daily interactions. At one point, I stepped away to check the mail and found a note slipped under the door from my son. It was brief, simply acknowledging my guidance during the house's legal issues and expressing a desire to learn from my experience. It was not a dramatic apology, but a quiet gesture that spoke volumes about reflection, accountability, and the subtle shifts in perception. I tucked the note into my journal, recognizing that moments like these were far more meaningful than any immediate expression of gratitude. They signaled enduring change. Later that afternoon, I took a walk around the property, observing the younger members of the family tending to small tasks without being asked. The fences had been repaired, the garden watered, and small repairs attended to. Each act was a quiet acknowledgement of responsibility and respect for the shared space. I reflected on how authority and influence often manifest in these small, seemingly mundane acts, far more than in overt confrontation or assertion. The eviction attempt had created a rupture, but the consistent modeling of calm, firm guidance had transformed that rupture into a bridge for deeper engagement and cooperation. During a brief conversation with a cousin, I noticed a change in tone that had previously been impossible to imagine. He spoke candidly about concerns he had harbored during the eviction attempt, admitting he had underestimated both my knowledge and my patience. His honesty felt like a release of unspoken tension, and I realized that confrontation, when met with composure and clarity, could become a catalyst for self-reflection in others. The recognition of past misjudgments created space for dialogue and, ultimately, reconciliation. As the day wore on, I reflected on the broader implications of these interactions. Respect and authority are not static. They are cultivated through consistent behavior and mutual understanding. The eviction confrontation had been a moment of tension, yes, but it had also been an educational turning point for the family. I considered how often conflicts escalate unnecessarily when patience, clarity, and steady guidance are absent. My approach had demonstrated that authority can be maintained not through intimidation or aggression, but through quiet, deliberate action. Evening brought a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of the eviction attempt weeks earlier. I observed family members preparing for dinner, moving through the house with a cooperative rhythm. Small gestures, passing utensils, asking for opinions, offering assistance, demonstrated the enduring shift in behavior. I felt a sense of satisfaction that was understated but deeply rooted in the knowledge that respect and attentiveness had become habitual rather than forced. Before bed, I revisited the note from my son, reflecting on how each quiet moment throughout the day had reinforced its message. The house, once the setting of tension and conflict, now felt like a space of subtle collaboration and attentive engagement. It was a reminder that change often manifests gradually, through consistent effort and thoughtful modeling of behavior, rather than through dramatic gestures alone. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of quiet contemplation, recognizing that the eviction confrontation, which had initially seemed like a disruptive and stressful event, had become a defining turning point in the household. The transformation was not theatrical. It was subtle, authentic, and enduring. The lessons learned, the shifts in attitude, and the renewed attentiveness demonstrated that resilience, preparation, and composure could yield profound results, even in the aftermath of conflict. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long, warm streaks across the living room. For the first time since the eviction threat, the house felt completely like mine. Not because of legal documentation alone, but because of the atmosphere that had slowly transformed over weeks of careful observation, dialogue, and subtle assertion. I realized that the real victory had not been in the confrontation itself, but in the restoration of dignity, respect, and balance within my family. Every glance, every interaction, seemed to carry a quiet acknowledgement of the boundaries that had once been tested and were now firmly understood. I spent the first hour quietly moving through the rooms, noticing the small details that reflected change. The furniture had been arranged thoughtfully, shared spaces were organized with intention, and there was a sense of collaborative effort evident in the way chores and responsibilities were being managed. My children were present but not obtrusive, moving around with a mindful energy that suggested both comfort and respect. It struck me that authority, when exercised with patience and integrity, had a way of reshaping relationships without the need for loud declarations or conflict escalation. Later in the morning, my son approached me, hesitant yet genuine. He spoke carefully, acknowledging how his impatience and assumptions had contributed to the previous tension. I listened without interruption, allowing the words to land fully. It was not a dramatic apology, but rather a quiet confession that reflected his own reflection and growth. In that moment, I understood that confrontation had served as a mirror, showing each of us what needed attention in our behavior and communication. The eviction threat had been a catalyst, but the real transformation occurred through ongoing patience, observation, and subtle guidance. As the afternoon unfolded, my daughter-in-law joined me for a conversation in the kitchen. Her tone was measured, her words intentional. She admitted to underestimating my understanding of both the house and the nuances of family dynamics. I responded calmly, emphasizing that respect and cooperation were ongoing practices rather than one-time gestures. Her acknowledgement felt sincere, and I sensed that her awareness of my perspective had shifted. She was beginning to see me as both an equal participant and an authority figure whose guidance mattered. The day continued with small, significant interactions. Tasks that once would have been ignored or delegated grudgingly were now approached with consideration. A neighbor stopped by to offer assistance with a minor repair, and my children actively collaborated with her without instruction. It was subtle, almost invisible progress, but unmistakably present. These actions were emblematic of the broader change. A shift from reactive behavior motivated by confrontation to proactive behavior motivated by respect and understanding. The house, once the site of stress and disputes, had become a space of quiet collaboration and mutual acknowledgement. During late afternoon, I revisited the legal documents, the deed that had sparked the initial conflict. Holding it in my hands, I felt the weight not as a symbol of property or control, but as a reminder of the responsibility and vigilance required to protect both family and self-respect. I reflected on how easily authority can be overlooked until it is challenged, and how critical it is to act with both clarity and composure when boundaries are tested. The document itself had been a tool, but it was the measured approach to asserting its importance that had created lasting change. Evening brought a chance to sit together as a family, sharing stories and laughter in a way that had been impossible during weeks of tension. Conversations were calm, attentive, and inclusive, marked by a willingness to listen and respond thoughtfully. I observed how small gestures, a cup of tea offered, a chair pulled out, an opinion solicited, were now embedded in the rhythm of daily life. Respect and authority had become integrated, not imposed, and I recognized that the eviction confrontation had ultimately served as a turning point in establishing these patterns. Later, I reflected privately on the journey that had led to this point. The disruption and tension from the eviction threat had been painful, yes, but it had also exposed vulnerabilities, misjudgments, and opportunities for growth. By responding with calm firmness, clear communication, and quiet persistence, I had transformed what could have been a divisive experience into one of reconciliation, awareness, and empowerment. The lessons were clear. Dignity is reinforced through consistency, respect emerges from mindful action, and patience can turn confrontation into opportunity. That night, as the household settled into quiet, I walked through the property one last time. The garden glowed softly in the fading light. Small repairs had been attended to, and the space itself felt alive with the subtle energy of collaboration and attentiveness. I realized that the house, the deed, and the legal battles were only part of the story. The real outcome lay in the shift within hearts and behaviors, in the way authority and respect were now understood and practiced. The transformation was quiet, almost invisible, yet profound and enduring. Finally, I sat in the living room with my journal, noting down the sequence of events and reflections. I wrote about the confrontation, the small gestures that followed, and the lessons learned about authority, patience, and family dynamics. I understood that this story would not only serve as a personal record, but also as a guide for navigating future challenges. The deed was more than paper. It was a symbol of foresight, resilience, and the quiet power of acting with clarity and integrity. As the night deepened, I felt a sense of resolution. The eviction attempt, which had once loomed like a threat over my home and family, had been transformed into a story of empowerment, mutual respect, and enduring change. I knew the journey was ongoing, that human relationships are fluid and require constant attention, but the foundation had been laid. What began as a moment of tension had evolved into a sustained transformation, one that promised stability, dignity, and meaningful connection moving forward. Sitting there in the quiet aftermath, I felt the weight of years pressing down. The quiet sacrifices, the unspoken hopes, and the invisible scars left by those I trusted most. I realized dignity isn't something others grant. It's something you quietly reclaim, moment by moment, even when the world tries to push you aside. Every slight, every betrayal, every dismissal becomes a mirror reflecting how much strength you've quietly carried. That day, I understood that standing firm doesn't require confrontation. It requires knowing your worth and letting it shine in moments when it matters most. The power isn't in revenge or proving them wrong. It's in reclaiming your presence, your voice, and your peace. And as I reflect on those moments, I can't help but think about the quiet confrontations that unfold in families. The times when someone expects silence but receives a revelation instead. If moments like that resonate with you, there's another story waiting that explores exactly what happens when someone refuses to be overlooked, when respect is demanded in the face of audacious disregard. You'll see how standing up quietly, with patience and strategy, can turn a seemingly small act into a profound reckoning. Don't miss the next story where dignity finds its stage in the most unexpected place.